What's a new way you sound so sincere? How sweet it must be to be able to think so clear. But you're just another in a long line of fools. Giving us freedom with a new set of rules.
Hello all, my name is Darryl Egan. I'm a member of IPAN, which is the Independent Peace Australia Network, and I'm a member of the United Nations Association of Australia. We are currently at a very dangerous time globally as we move further to a multipolar world order, with a conflict in Ukraine and an economic peer competitor Cold War between the US and China, which Australia has been pulled into under the AUKUS security arrangement with the US and Britain in order to contain China. I am with Diane Sare. Diane is a strong voice against the war-inciting political establishment in the US and is running as an independent Senate candidate for New York in the upcoming US midterm elections on November 8. This midterm election date coincides with an Australian Joint Senate Committee hearing on defence, in which I put forward a submission in relation to a rethink on Australia supporting the Ukraine military, which benefits Ukraine's neo-Nazi battalions. Now is a time for more people to follow Diane, who advocates a peaceful economic development. Diane, thank you for joining me.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, and I'm good to see you, and I hope the campaign is going well.
I think so. You know, we've certainly made a number of breakthroughs in spite of the total blackout of the press and the attempts to suppress my candidacy by the major parties.
I'll get into that question about that, which is a very interesting one. It's no different here in Australia. Look, my first question is to give us a sense of the current dangerous geopolitical situation in relation to the US approach to the issue of Ukraine and the dangers in regards to the US hawkish approach to China, and what that means for Australia, and what solutions are there through peaceful economic development.
Okay, that's quite a bit. Well, the US policy, unfortunately, since the Berlin Wall came down, if you want to take the latest phase of downshift, and I would say really the shift began the minute Franklin Roosevelt died. But after the Berlin Wall fell, Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, the neoconservatives basically said, we are the sole hegemon. We, the British, because they are very close to the GCHQ, are going to be the sole power, and no nation should ever supersede us or surpass us. Now, that's egotistical and stupid enough as it is, but if you're going to assert that and then totally collapse your own economy, where you shut down manufacturing and industry and allow your cities to become rubble heaps and destroy the culture, so you have a massive upsurge in crime and drug use and so on, and then you say no one should surpass us, well, that's really cruel. That's like some kind of sadomasochistic game where you insist that everyone be as depraved and backwards as you are. And I'm afraid that's what's happening. It looks like everything in our Declaration of Independence, which the British Empire was doing to the colonies, against which we revolted, we are now perpetrating against other nations. And I think in Australia, it's a very unfortunate situation. One, because Australia hasn't been able to fully liberate from the Queen. And then on the other hand, to have the United States using Australia as a pawn, and even now moving, B-52 bombers in. And I mean, this is very, very dangerous. It's a terrible situation. And I know there are many people there that are not happy about this. I think all of us have to organize the resistance in our nations and then combined to back each other up against this Anglo-Saxon Dutch, you know, slime mold, whatever it is.
We don't get a vote here whether when we go to war with the US, whether it was Vietnam or any other war. Look, I'm 55 years of age. My dad actually took me when I was a little child at 4 years old, I think, to an anti-Vietnam War march. When I was a child in the 1970s, I had a friend whose father had post-traumatic stress from the Vietnam War. He was in the Vietnam War. And I get a bit emotional when I think about it and what his father went through. So it doesn't bring anything good to a society.
No, it's I just, on that point, I'm so glad you brought it up, and I haven't actually discussed this with anyone else on the campaign, but I'm almost exactly your age, 1 year older. My father was drafted, even though my family is Quaker going way back. So he served in the medical capacity for 1 year in Vietnam, and we lived on a military base, and then we moved off base. But one of my most vivid memories was my mother taking me with her to visit women whose husbands had died. And I was maybe 4. I was 4 years old. And I remember, you know, when you would pluck a dandelion, and I don't know if you have that there, if you blow all the seeds off in one breath, you get a wish.
Right.
Every wish I had was that this war would end. And that was for a 4-year-old, my 4-year-old memories.
Yeah, and look, and it's just really distressing how, you know, a person like Gough Whitlam, who was a leader, a prime minister in Australia, he took us out of the Vietnam War. Now, he was with the Labor Party, or what you call the traditional left. Now you have the current left Labor Party warmongering. I mean, Gough Whitlam would turn in his grave if he saw what was happening now. You know, and this is what's, I can't wrap my head around it. I can't wrap my head around the traditional left being like this. But I'm going to go into another question. Can you give us also, in regards to the political campaign, can you give us a current situation of your Senate campaign? And do you think there is any undemocratic, corporate-funded political duopoly regime? Is there one, that type of, if I framed it right, in the US, you know, this corporate duopoly,
Well, I don't know
regime,
why you
I call it,
asked
in the US, which is perpetuated by the US media that freezes out candidates like yourself.
I have no idea why you'd be asking such a question. Yes, absolutely. And it is money. I mean, look, we've been bailing out the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank. We've been printing money hand over fist to bail out a bunch of speculative garbage, which has to collapse. Now, Klaus Schwab has this thing they call the Great Reset, which is really a fascist totalitarian order of bankers to deny the right of nations to have sovereignty and economic development. And of course, the situation in the United States is completely a free-for-all. There's no regulation. There's limits on how much someone can donate to a federal campaign. But to give you an example, there's no limit of what the candidate can spend of their own money. So since I'm not a multimillionaire like Chuck Schumer, the House Majority Leader, he has something like $30 million in his campaign chest. I, on the other hand, have raised all my money below the legal limit of $2,900 per person. And I don't have millions, so it's not there. So it's very controlled. And then you combine that with the control of the news media, where it's right out in the open. I mean, look, what's his name? John Brennan, who was the head of the CIA, is now an anchorman at MSNBC. So in the United States, it is not even a secret. It's right in front of your face that leaders of our lying, treasonous intelligence community have taken over the media full force. So if you wonder why we have such overwhelming wartime propaganda, why candidates like myself are not given a voice or simply denied participation in debates arbitrarily. This is what you have, and both parties seem to be quite unified. Now there's fear, I hope justified fear, that if they get a Republican majority in the House and in the Senate, that the funding for the military operation, the US funding for the Ukrainian Nazi regime, will be cut, or at least cut back dramatically, which might force a negotiated end to this. But I think if they just cut the money, that doesn't mean you're going to have peace. Unfortunately, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say that it just seems like you've got a economic and military oligarch running over there that just sort of captures the whole political landscape, and really it's not, I don't see a lot of democracy in it personally.
Right.
And here in Australia, talking about campaign donations, in Australia they have to disclose. In Australia, politicians have to disclose how much they get above a certain amount, but the way they get around that is they set up this side trust where the money's filtered through, so they get around that issue of disclosing the amount that they get from lobbyists. So it's a bit disturbing. And my next question would have to be, do you think there is a new way political movement in the US from the established Republican and Democratic parties that are affected by war hawks? Do you think there's got to be a new wave of other parties or coalition of other parties to break it? Because the traditional left used to believe in no war like you do. But this current left, liberalism left, they just seem like they have virtual signal on things with what we say in Australia, we say fair income, which means genuine. They virtual signal things without any fair income action. You know, they'll say things about, oh, we are there for the African-American community in voice, but in action, you don't see it. So what's your thoughts on that?
Yes, actually, even in this election, I was very pleased to find several either independent candidates or maverick Democrats like this fellow Jeff Young, who actually won the Democratic primary in Kentucky. Now, it's still really tough for independents to get any traction, but the one perhaps slightly less biased poll I saw, for example, had me at 5.1% of the vote, which frankly is much greater than either the Libertarian or Green parties got before in statewide races. And I think it's indicative of a mood in the population. People are really sick of the divisiveness between the major parties. They've had it. They don't like the fighting over stupid issues, especially when the two parties come together for all the things they hate, like World War III and more hyperinflationary bailouts. And I can't tell you, when we were getting these signatures to put me on the ballot, how many people said, what party is she with? And when our organizer said independent, she's with LaRouche, she's independent, they said, oh, thank God, I'm so sick of the parties. I just left my party. So I do. I don't know if you'll see that much of it in this particular cycle, but I can tell you it is growing. And a number of the independents I ran across the country are very substantial, solid people. These are not sham campaigns because someone just went on an ego trip.
I think also, I don't know if it exists in the US, but here in Australia, we have still some traditional left people with the values of anti-war, economic sovereignty, and those issues that are less with that, I suppose, global liberalism view of things. So I think there needs to be a reaching out to those people to bring them in on things that we agree upon. I think that's a very important step, because we need to have those open discussions and not have this cancel culture of not discussing issues just because we may be on two different political areas, but we agree on a lot of mutual things.
Yeah. One thing also I really want to bring up, I was discussing it with someone, I forget who, but they pointed out that Obama was virtually the death knell of the anti-war movement, because the anti-war movement also grew out of Martin Luther King's the civil rights movement. And so everyone was so thrilled to get the first Black president, but then he turned out to be a warmonger. And they didn't want to attack that. Now, Lyndon LaRouche did, we did, but it really, it was extremely destructive. The Obama presidency, and LaRouche warned about it, he said this will set the civil rights movement back 50 years, having this guy, because he was the same thing as Bush. He just basically looked a little different and was a better speaker.
And there's people in the African community, American community, who believe that he didn't do a hell of a lot for them anyway when he was in.
No, not at all. And a great number of the African American voters actually turned out for Donald Trump. In fact, one guy I know, an old Clinton Democrat in the Midwest, told this funny story because he said the press was coming up and asking people how they were voting. This was in 2016. And he said there was an African American gentleman in front of him, and they said, "How are you voting?" And he said, "Well, I'm voting for Donald Trump." And the reporter was really taken aback. "What? Isn't he a racist? Isn't he and the guy said, "Well, he may be a racist, but I think most presidents have been racist, and this racist is going to give me a job."
And maybe that's a signal that there needs to be another political dimension to come out. And in what you're leading and in what you can reach out to other, as I said, whether the traditional left people or other people that can come together and have a new way and have a new system that can break away from this duopoly, which are controlled by the military establishment and by corporates. They're just funded by them. It is just so obvious. And I hear when you talk, and I even other independent people in Australia talk, but then I hear during this campaign these lame speeches. They mean nothing. They've got no substance. There's nothing to them. Like, yes, we can, these lame sayings. It's like they hypnotize people with these things. And people go, hurrah, and, all this, but they don't know what they're cheering. It has no substance to it. And we need to bring substance back into politics.
I agree.
And my next question I've got for you is, in Australia, and this goes into the traditional left side I was talking about. In Australia, I remember when traditional left Labor Party politics here was anti-war, right? Back in the early 1970s, mid-1970s, with the people who protest against nuclear weapons. There has been a shift, a huge shift into the 80s and 90s here in Australia up to now. What is your message to these traditional Labor left people here in Australia that may still hold those values?
Well, I think it's time to speak out. I think too many people have been quiet. They believe, well, maybe when it gets really bad, they'll end up coming out and telling the truth. So they're sort of waiting to see if things get bad enough. And it's bad enough. It's more than bad enough already. I think people have to not be afraid to rock the boat. I mean, I'm on this State Department funded Ukrainian hit list for just saying that we should not continue this way, sending billions of dollars worth of weapons over to Ukraine, and there should be a negotiated settlement. And this was not an unprovoked invasion, as everyone says. So now I'm a Russian propagandist, information terrorist. So I think there's some fear, which you might say is legitimate, that people have from rocking the boat, but I think they better consider the bigger fear, which is that we really are marching toward nuclear war. I mean, the fact that the United States now has boots on the ground in Ukraine, you can call them inspectors, but what happens if they're quote unquote inspecting a munitions depot and they get blown away by a Russian strike? Where are we then? It's extremely dangerous.
They're not thinking what's the end game to all this. They're just thinking about the moment. And what you're saying about that list you've been put on, I think a 14-year-old girl got put on that one, or 13-year-old girl, for speaking about peace in the Donbass. And also Eduard Delinsky, who's the leader of the Ukraine Jewish Committee, who spoke out against Nazism in Ukraine, has been put on that list as an enemy of the state. Now, for these people who deny and say, oh, look, Ukraine doesn't have Nazism, what sort of country puts a leader of the Ukraine Jewish Committee on or allows him to be on this hit list for speaking out against neo-Nazism within their military, within their celebrations of Stepan Bandera, in their postage stamps of World War II Ukraine Nazis who massacred Jews in the Lviv programs and the Baba Yar massacre? What country puts someone on such a hit, or allows them to be on such a hit list? The brown shirts in Nazi Germany would be so proud of that. It's astonishing.
Yeah, and no, it's a straight out Nazi tactic. I don't know how anyone can condone it, really.
And look, my final question, Diane, is what is your message to peace organisations such as IPAN, which I'm a member of, to them? And are you open to have further discussions and interactions with peace organisations in Australia like IPAN and Wage Peace and others that are going against the AUKUS deal? And I'd like to put it out there to everybody on 24th of November. There is a protest by IPAN at the front of Parliament House in Canberra over AUKUS. So I would encourage people to go to the IPAN Facebook site or Twitter site and keep up to date with that. So what is your message to these peace groups, and are you happy to interact with them in the future?
Oh, absolutely. I'm more than happy. I think we really have to collaborate. We're in the same battle. I think we can enrich each other, inspire each other, and learn, because our enemy is not creative. What these people are doing goes, you can trace it back to the Roman Empire. You can trace it back maybe to Satan himself. They're just not creative, so they don't come up with new things. Divide and conquer, that's old. So we shouldn't keep doing the same thing over and over again. We should come up with flanks where we can defeat them. Also, the beautiful thing about these people is they are so pompous and arrogant that if we don't give up and we keep resisting, they will make mistakes, like Liz Truss sending that text message to Tony Blinken on her personal cell phone, not the encrypted phone, right after the pipelines were blown up, saying it is done. Now that is the most incriminating piece of, I think, many pieces of evidence that the Russians have on the British involvement in that. And there has to be accountability. The other thing I would say for all of us in these peace movements is it's urgent. Just as in war, you have to have a vision of what you are fighting for. Peace is not merely the absence of war. And FDR was so clear on this. He told Churchill that, he said, look, the United States is not in this for the British, French, Dutch to keep all of their colonies. What is the difference between the British East India Company and what goes on in the concentration camps? People starved to death, worked to death, killed, determined, or what, the Belgians did in the Congo, or what was done in Sierra Leone. You chop someone's hand off if they don't bring back enough diamonds or whatever it is. Really hideous brutality. So FDR said, at the end of this war, we're going to change relations among mankind. No more colonies. Everyone should have their independence. Everyone should have the right to economic sovereignty. That means no child on the planet should be without clean drinking water, a roof over his or her head, electricity, a modern healthcare system, That is, we have to resolve that's what we're doing. It's not
And
just
that was
absence of war.
that's the founding principles of Theodore Roosevelt and his wife in establishing with the UN.
Franklin Roosevelt.
Franklin Roosevelt. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Sorry, not Franklin Roosevelt. I'm thinking someone else. But
Okay.
I mean, they are the principles of life. And one quick question before we wrap up. When you talk about economic development, do you think there also should be some sustainability with that in regards to, also taking care of the environment and making sure that development doesn't impact on some, rural or Indigenous people in countries? So can you give me some context on that one before we wrap up?
Well, look, I think we have to look at the development of the biosphere. If you study the development of life, things went from very simple single-celled organisms to fish, to amphibians, to reptiles, to mammals. What's the feature of this? That life became more energy dense and more complex. And when you make the leap to human beings, we can evolve by an act of will. You make a scientific discovery and you change the relationship of the species to nature. The discovery of the use of fire, the discovery of the use of a combustion engine. This is the most natural thing in the world. So part of the problem of the so-called environmentalist movement is if they say, well, we have to consume less energy, then you're really going against nature. I mean, then you're saying, it's like in Europe, telling people who had gas and coal and nuclear power to go back to burning wood. You're condemning people to die and you're going to destroy the environment. So what is natural is to come up with sources of energy which are more and more dense for smaller amounts of fuel, like nuclear fission, the new high temperature reactors which reprocess the waste and give you more energy. We really should have had fusion by now. And one would, I mean, there's things beyond that, matter, antimatter, and all kinds of plasmas. And I mean, we haven't even gotten there, but somehow we're really stifling ourselves. We're saying growth is bad, turn off your brain, we know everything, as opposed to saying there's so much about the universe that we just have no understanding of whatsoever. Why don't we dedicate ourselves to having a better understanding of the relationship between human creativity and the development of the biosphere? Because I would maintain that when we are working that way, we actually improve the environment. I mean, imagine taking a nuclear power plant, desalinating seawater, greening the deserts, you modify the climate in a way, that makes things more manageable without the extremes that can set off severe hurricanes and this and that.
Yeah.
So I think we have to look at it that way. And sustainable, the only sustainable is growth. That's the only thing that works. If you try to go backwards, you just see an increase in the death rate.
And look, within growth, there can be recycling. There can be also, as you said, there can be answers to other fuel sources. And that's not saying we throw out solar and get rid of wind, but it's in the mix. And with that, I'd like to wrap up. I'd like to wish you all the best in your campaign. And you do get heard over there. And I'd like to say to the people in the US to listen to Diane, engage with Diane, and have those conversations, because that's what leads to good results for everybody around the world, is more dialogue, less war, and less divisiveness. Thank you, Diane, for your time.
Well, thank you very much. And thanks for what you're doing. And please keep intervening and send those videotapes.
I will do, mate. And anytime you're in Australia, you're welcome. And I'll get you a beer if you do drink a beer, and put on a barbecue for you.
That sounds wonderful.
All right. Thanks, mate. Good luck.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.